In this gripping story, a retired Army veteran's reunion with his military canine takes an unexpected turn when a mishap threatens to derail everything. But when all hope seems lost, one special item changes everything. What will happen when the unbreakable bond between soldier and dog is put to the ultimate test? Don't miss this emotional journey, and don't forget to subscribe and share where you're watching from, to honor our incredible veterans. The automated sliding doors of Dallas International Airport parted with a soft whoosh, but Joe Carter barely noticed. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the bustling cargo terminal. Every movement, every sound seemed amplified. The beeping of forklifts, the hum of distant conversations, the occasional bark of a dog. None of it mattered. All Joe could focus on was the clock hanging above the counter, the digital numbers flickering relentlessly forward. Hunter was supposed to be here by now. Joe adjusted the weight of his duffel bag on his shoulder, his fingers nervously brushing the patch sewn on the side. Retired Army Sergeant. It wasn't just his title, it was his identity. Yet, even with all the courage he had summoned in his years of service, he couldn't shake the knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. "Relax, honey," came Alyssa's calm voice from his side. She rested a hand on his arm, giving him a gentle squeeze. "They probably just need a few more minutes to unload the crates." Joe nodded but couldn't bring himself to smile. Alyssa had been his rock since the day he met her, through deployments, injuries, and the difficult transition back to civilian life. But this was different. This wasn't just any day. Today he was finally getting Hunter back. His partner, his protector, and, in many ways, the only soul who truly understood the depths of his struggles. They'd been through hell together in Afghanistan. Long, grueling patrols. Hunter sniffing out IEDs buried beneath the scorching sand, saving lives, including Joe's, more times than he could count. When Joe was honorably discharged after an injury, leaving Hunter behind, it felt like losing a part of himself. It had taken over a year of paperwork, phone calls, and advocacy, but finally the day had come. Hunter was retired too, and he was coming home to Joe. "Name?" asked a tired-looking woman at the cargo desk, snapping Joe out of his thoughts. She didn't bother looking up as she tapped away at a keyboard. "Hunter," Joe said, stepping forward. "German Shepherd, flight from Denver, crate ID, He fumbled with the paperwork in his hand, quickly passing it to her. The woman sighed, flipping through the forms. "Give me a second." Joe's jaw tightened as she continued typing, her face devoid of emotion. Minutes ticked by, and Joe felt his patience wearing thin. "Ma'am? I've been waiting a long time for this. Is everything all right?" The woman hesitated before turning to her screen. "I'm not seeing a crate logged under this ID for arrival today," she said flatly. "What do you mean you're not seeing it?" Joe's voice sharpened, drawing a glance from Alyssa. The woman shrugged. "Could have been delayed, happens all the time." Joe leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Happens all the time? This isn't some misplaced luggage we're talking about? It's a military working dog?" Her expression didn't change. "Sir, I'll check again, but if it's not here, there's nothing I can—" "I don't want excuses," Joe snapped, his voice carrying across the terminal. Several heads turned, but he didn't care. He stepped back, hands running through his short-cropped hair, forcing himself to breathe. "I'm sorry, just... please. Can you check again?" Alyssa touched his arm. "Let me try," she whispered, stepping between Joe and the counter. "Ma'am, if there's a way to escalate this, we'd appreciate it. It's really important." The woman finally looked up, her eyes softening slightly at Alyssa's calm demeanor. "All right, I'll call someone in the back." She grabbed a phone and dialed. Joe turned away, pacing in tight circles. The sound of his boots on the polished floor echoed loudly in his ears. He hated how easily his temper flared these days. Ever since coming home, little things could set him off. The VA called it adjustment issues, but he knew better. It was the weight of everything, what he'd seen, what he'd done, what he'd left behind. And now the one thing he had fought to bring home was missing. "Excuse me, sir," came a voice from behind him. Joe turned to see a younger man in a uniform holding a clipboard. I'm the shift manager. I understand there's an issue with your 9. Yes, Joe said, his voice clipped. Hunter was supposed to be on the flight from Denver. They're saying they don't have him. The manager flipped through some pages. It's possible there was a mix-up in the routing. Sometimes crates get redirected to a connecting flight. Let me see what I can find. Joe crossed his arms tightly, his mind racing. A mix-up? Redirected? That wasn't good enough. This was Hunter, his dog, his family. Sir, I'm going to need you to stay calm, the manager said, his tone cautious. We'll figure this out. Joe's eyes bore into the man. You'd better. Because if you don't, I promise you, I'll find him myself. The manager took a step back, nodding quickly before hurrying away. Alyssa stepped closer to Joe, wrapping her arms around his. We'll get him, Joe, she said softly. We'll find Hunter. We always do. Joe let out a shaky breath, leaning into her. He wanted to believe her words. He needed to. But in the pit of his stomach, a seed of doubt had already begun to grow. Joe stood by the counter, his fists clenched tightly at his sides as the minutes dragged on. He watched the manager disappear behind a set of doors marked Authorized Personnel Only, leaving Joe feeling even more helpless. Every muscle in his body ached with tension, a familiar tightness that he'd learned to suppress in war zones but struggled to control in the chaos of civilian life. Alyssa stayed close, her presence grounding him as much as it could. Hey, you okay? She asked softly. Joe didn't answer right away. His gaze was fixed on the door, as if sheer willpower could make the manager reappear with good news. Finally, he shook his head. No, I'm not. This isn't just a mistake, Alyssa. This is incompetence. Joe? Alyssa began, but he was already moving, pacing back and forth across the small waiting area. Nearby, a young man in a cargo vest glanced up from loading crates. Joe caught his eye and strode over. You, Joe said, his tone sharp. You work here, right? Can you tell me where the dogs are brought in? The worker blinked, startled. Yeah. They usually come through the east dock. Show me, Joe demanded. Joe, Elise called, alarm creeping into her voice. Let them handle it. They said they're looking into it. Joe rounded on her, his voice lowering but no less intense. I trusted people to handle it before, Lisa. That's how soldiers end up with no support. That's how people get left behind. Lisa. Elisa's eyes softened. She knew that tone, the weight of memories he didn't talk about. Okay, she said gently. But let's not make this worse. We'll ask again, together. Joe exhaled sharply, but nodded. He turned back to the cargo worker, who still looked uneasy. Thanks for the info, Joe muttered before walking back toward the counter. Her boss wasn't the best dealer in the world, so her perceptions were limited. Part of life, after all, was perception being real. Just as he reached it, the manager returned, his expression unreadable. Joe's stomach sank. Well, Joe demanded. Where is he? The manager hesitated, glancing at Lissa as though looking for a buffer. When she offered none, he cleared his throat. It looks like Hunter's crate may have been rerouted to Houston by mistake. I've contacted their team and they're checking to see if the crate is there. Austin, Joe's voice echoed across the terminal. How the hell do you send a living, breathing dog to the wrong city? Do you have any idea what this dog has been through? What I've been through just to get him here? The manager took a step back, raising his hands defensively. I understand. This is frustrating. No, you don't understand, Joe interrupted, his voice trembling with restrained anger. Hunter isn't cargo, he's a soldier. He saved lives. He saved my life. And now you're telling me he's been rerouted like some suitcase? Sir, I'm doing everything I can. Not enough. Joe's voice cracked under the weight of emotion. He wasn't just angry, he was scared. Scared of losing Hunter. Scared that the system had failed him again. Joe, Elisa said, stepping forward, let's take a moment to think this through. Joe clenched his jaw, his chest heaving. He could feel the stares of strangers nearby, their murmurs adding to his frustration. Then, from behind him, a voice cut through the tension. Hey, is this about a dog? Joe turned to see a woman holding up her phone. I overheard what's going on, she continued. I work for a local news outlet. People care about stories like this. Veterans, service animals. If the airline's screwing up, the public deserves to know. Joe hesitated. The idea of dragging this into the spotlight felt both empowering and overwhelming. Before he could respond, Alyssa placed a hand on his arm. Joe, she said softly, maybe this could help. He looked into her eyes, searching for reassurance, then back at the woman. Fine, he said, but this isn't about shaming anyone. This is about finding Hunter. The woman nodded and began recording. This is Joe Carter, a retired Army sergeant waiting for his military 9 Hunter to arrive home after years of service. The airline misplaced the crate, and now his dog is missing. Answer made. Colonel Price smiled. Joe stepped into the frame, his voice steady but filled with conviction. Hunter isn't just a dog. He's my partner, my family. I fought to bring him home, and I won't let bureaucracy or carelessness take him away. I need your help. Anyone who can share this, call the airline, anything. Let's get Hunter home. He sat. The video ended, and within minutes it was uploaded to social media. Joe barely had time to process what he'd done before his phone started buzzing. Comments, retweets, and shares flooded in, strangers from all over offering support and outrage. Look, Alyssa said, showing him the screen. It's already going viral. Joe rubbed his hands over his face, the initial rush of action giving way to exhaustion. Now what? He muttered. Now, Alyssa said, her tone firm, we wait, and we don't give up. Joe nodded, his resolve hardening once more. He wasn't going to let this end here, not for Hunter, not for what they'd been through together. Somewhere out there his dog was waiting, and Joe would move mountains to bring him home. Joe sat on the cold, hard bench in the airport terminal, staring at his phone screen. The video had reached tens of thousands of views in under an hour, and comments poured in from people offering support, resources, and outrage at the airline. Yet none of it mattered if Hunter wasn't found. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the relentless tide of emotions he was fighting to keep in check. Hunter, Mr. Carter? The shift manager called, approaching with cautious steps. Joe shot to his feet, Alyssa close behind. What's the update? Joe asked, his voice tight. The manager avoided eye contact. We've confirmed that Hunter's crate was sent to Houston by mistake, he began. Their team found the crate at their cargo facility, but... But what? Joe demanded, his voice rising. The manager hesitated, clearly weighing his words. They say the crate arrived with some signs of damage. Hunter, He managed to break free. They're trying to locate him now. Joe's world froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid as the words sank in. He's loose, he said slowly, each word dripping with disbelief. You lost my dog? Sir, please understand. No, Joe snapped, stepping closer, his face inches from the manager's. You don't get to tell me to understand. Hunter is out there, alone, in a strange place, because your people screwed up. Do you have any idea what could happen to him? Joe, Alyssa said, gripping his arm, let's take a breath. Joe pulled back, his chest heaving as he tried to steady himself. He turned away, pacing in short, furious strides. Hunter, his partner, his lifeline, was somewhere in Houston, terrified and vulnerable. The thought was unbearable. Sir, the Houston team has animal control assisting in the search, the manager added quickly. We've also dispatched additional personnel to help. Joe spun back around. I'm going to Houston. The manager blinked. What? You heard me, Joe said, his tone brooking no argument. I'm not sitting here while you play damage control. Book me the next flight, or I'll drive there myself. Joe, wait, Alyssa interjected. Think this through. What if they find Hunter while we're in the air? You won't be able to help. Joe shook his head, his voice breaking. I can't just sit here, Alyssa. I need to do something. Before anyone could respond, Joe's phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Hello? "Is this Sergeant Carter?" a woman's voice asked. She sounded official but compassionate. "Yes," Joe replied cautiously. "This is Officer Daniels with Houston Animal Control. I wanted to let you know that we've just received a sighting of a German Shepherd matching Hunter's description near the cargo facility. We're heading there now." Joe's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm coming," he said firmly. "Keep me updated." "I'll be there as soon as I can." "Joe?" Elisa started, but he cut her off. "I'm going," he repeated, meeting her eyes. "You can stay if you want, but I can't wait here any longer." Elisa sighed, her own frustration evident, but she nodded. "Then we'll go together." Hours later, Joe and Elisa arrived at the sprawling cargo facility in Houston. The air was thick and humid, and the sun had already begun to set, casting long shadows across the lot. Joe wasted no time approaching a group of workers and animal control officers gathered near the facility gates. "I'm Sergeant Joe Carter," he announced. "Where's Hunter?" One of the officers stepped forward. "We've been tracking him," she said, holding up a tablet with a live GPS feed. "He's staying near the facility. It's likely he's scared and sticking close to familiar smells from the crate." Joe's heart ached at the thought. Hunter was trained to be fearless in combat, but he was still just a dog, a loyal, loving creature thrown into a chaotic situation. "Let me help," Joe said. "Hunter knows my voice. He'll come to me." The officer hesitated, then nodded. "Stay close to us. We'll guide you to where he was last seen." They moved as a unit, the group fanning out across the dimly lit lot. Joe's eyes scanned every shadow, every corner, his voice breaking the silence. "Hunter," he called, his tone steady but urgent. "Hunter, it's me, Buddy. I'm here." Minutes passed with no sign of movement, and doubt began to creep into Joe's mind. What if Hunter had run farther than they thought? What if someone else had found him first? He shook his head, forcing the thoughts away. He couldn't afford to lose hope. "Wait," one of the officers whispered, pointing toward a stack of shipping pallets. "I see something." Joe's breath caught as a shape emerged from the shadows, a large, familiar figure with pointed ears and a wagging tail. "Hunter!" Joe dropped to his knees, his voice trembling as he called out again. "Hunter, it's me, Buddy. Come here." "What's the name of the place you want me to go to?" Hunter froze, his body tense and uncertain. The months apart, the strange surroundings, the stress, it all showed in the hesitation in his amber eyes. Joe's heart broke as he realized Hunter didn't fully recognize him. "What?" Thinking fast, Joe reached into his bag and pulled out Hunter's old tactical harness. It was worn and frayed, but it carried the scents and memories of their time together. He held it out, his voice soft and full of emotion. "You remember this, don't you, boy? It's me. Come on, Hunter." Hunter sniffed the air, his ears perking up. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped closer. Joe stayed still, tears streaming down his face as Hunter finally reached him, sniffed the harness, and let out a soft, familiar whine. "That's my boy," Joe whispered, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck as Hunter leaned into him. The months of separation, the chaos of the day, all melted away in that moment. Hunter was home. Joe knelt in the gravel, his arms wrapped tightly around Hunter's neck. For the first time in what felt like forever, he exhaled deeply, the weight of months apart and the chaotic day finally lifting off his chest. Hunter, his loyal partner, pressed into him, his body trembling but trusting, as though he too had been waiting for this moment. "You're okay now, buddy," Joe whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I've got you. I'm not letting you go again." The officers and volunteers who had been assisting stood back, giving the pair their space. Elisa, standing a few feet away, wiped a tear from her cheek and smiled softly. She had seen Joe's walls come down before, on their wedding day when their daughter was born. But this was different. This was raw, unfiltered love and relief. Hunter barked once, a short but clear sound, as if affirming Joe's words. His tail wagged for the first time since the ordeal began, stirring up small clouds of dust. Joe chuckled, running a hand through the thick fur on Hunter's neck. "You scared the hell out of me, you know that?" Joe said, leaning back to look Hunter in the eye. The dog's amber gaze softened, his ears perking up at Joe's familiar voice. It was as if all the confusion, the stress of being lost, was fading with each passing second. Joe stood slowly, his joints stiff from hours of tension, but his grip on Hunter's leash was firm. Elisa stepped closer, her smile widening. "It's so beautiful," she said softly, reaching out to pet Hunter. The dog flinched slightly at first, but Joe murmured something soothing, and Hunter leaned into her hand. "Promise?" she asked. "He remembers you," Joe said, watching as Hunter's tail thumped against his leg. "I think he remembers everything." The officer who had been tracking Hunter's location stepped forward, her expression a mix of relief and professionalism. "Sergeant Carter, I'm glad we found him. He looks healthy, considering what he's been through." Joe nodded, glancing down at the dog who had saved his life countless times. "Hunter's tough," he said. "He always has been. We'll need to file a report about the incident," the officer continued. "But for now, he's all yours." Joe thanked her, his gratitude spilling over in a handshake that lasted a moment too long. "I can't thank you enough," he said, "for all of this." "It's our job," the officer replied with a smile. "And it's an honor to help someone like you and Hunter. You've both done more than your share for this country." As the group dispersed, leaving Joe, Elisa, and Hunter alone under the soft glow of the facility's floodlights, Joe felt the enormity of the day settle in. He crouched beside Hunter again, adjusting the old tactical harness onto the dog's back. The moment the straps clicked into place, Hunter straightened, his stance shifting instinctively into that of a working dog. "Still got it, huh?" Joe said, his voice tinged with pride. Hunter's ears twitched at the tone, and he barked once more. Elisa laughed lightly. "It's like he never left your side." Joe's smile faltered slightly as he stood. "Yeah," he said quietly. "But he did. And I let him down." Elisa frowned, stepping closer. "Joe, you didn't let him down. None of this was your fault. You did everything you could to bring him home." Joe shook his head, his gaze fixed on Hunter. "I was supposed to protect him, just like he protected me." "You did protect him," Elisa insisted. "You fought for him, Joe. You pushed through red tape, the VA, the military bureaucracy. You never gave up. And look where he is now. Right here, with you." Joe's jaw tightened, his emotions warring inside him. Finally he nodded, letting her words sink in. He reached down, scratching behind Hunter's ears. "We made it, didn't we, buddy?" he said softly. "We're both still standing." Hunter licked his hand, his tail wagging furiously. It was as if the dog understood exactly what Joe meant. Elisa slipped her hand into Joe's. "Let's take him home." The drive back to Dallas was quiet, save for the occasional sound of Hunter shifting in the back seat. Joe glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his heart swelling each time their eyes met. Hunter had curled into a familiar position, his head resting on his paws, his body relaxed for the first time since arriving stateside. "I think he's happy," Elisa said from the passenger seat. Joe smiled faintly. "I think he knows he's safe." When they pulled into their driveway, Joe opened the car door and called Hunter out. The dog jumped down with surprising agility, his nose immediately sniffing the air. It was his first time seeing the house, but something in his demeanor said he knew this was home. Inside, Joe showed Hunter around, introducing him to every corner of the house like an old friend. The dog seemed to approve, especially when they reached the living room, where Joe laid out a soft bed next to the couch. Hunter circled the bed twice before lying down, letting out a deep, contented sigh. Joe sat on the floor beside him, running a hand over his fur. "You're not just a good dog, Hunter," Joe whispered. "You're the best." As Elisa watched them from the doorway, she smiled. This wasn't just a reunion, it was a healing for both of them. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Joe and Elisa's living room. Hunter lay sprawled on his new bed, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. For the first time since his retirement, Joe felt a sense of completeness. He sat in the armchair nearby, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. The video of his plea at the airport had now amassed over 1 million views, with thousands of comments pouring in from all corners of the country. "Joe, you've got to see this," Elisa said, walking in with her tablet. She set it on the coffee table and hit play on a video from the local news. The anchor's voice was calm but pointed. "The story of Sergeant Joe Carter and his Military 9 Hunter has captured the nation's attention. After an airline mishap led to Hunter being lost, Joe's viral video sparked an outpouring of support. But it has also raised serious questions about how service animals are handled by commercial airlines." So, the screen cut to footage of Joe at the airport, his voice cracking as he described Hunter's service. Then it transitioned to interviews with veterans advocates, animal rights groups, and members of Congress. Words like accountability, reform, and respect for service animals scrolled across the screen in bold text. Joe rubbed the back of his neck, feeling a mix of pride and discomfort. "I didn't think it would blow up like this," he said. Elisa smiled and leaned over to kiss his cheek. "People care, Joe. You and Hunter deserve this recognition, and if it leads to better treatment for other veterans and their canines, it's worth it." Joe nodded, though a part of him still struggled with the attention. He had never sought the spotlight. All he wanted was Hunter. But if their story could make a difference, he wasn't going to shy away from it. Just then, his phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar number. Joe hesitated before answering. "This is Joe. Sergeant Carter, this is Susan Holland from the airline's executive team," the woman said, her tone formal but apologetic. "First, let me start by saying how deeply sorry we are for what you and Hunter experienced. Our staff failed to handle this situation with the care it deserved. Certainly no one should have died. The woman who called you and trusted you with her entire life's work should have been treated with the care it deserved." Joe frowned, his grip tightening on the phone. "You're right," he said. "You did fail." "I completely agree," Susan said, her voice softening. "That's why we're making immediate changes to how we handle service animals and military 9s. We're partnering with the leading veterans organization to train our staff, and we've allocated funds to create a dedicated transport program for service animals." Joe was silent for a moment, processing the information. It wasn't the full justice he'd wanted, but it was a start. "We'd also like to donate $100,000 in your and Hunter's names to a foundation of your choosing," Susan added. Joe glanced at Hunter, who had stirred and was watching him with curious eyes. "If you're serious about this," Joe said finally, "make the donation to the Veterans 9 Support Foundation. They're the reason Hunter and I were able to reconnect. Consider it done." Susan replied, "And again, we deeply regret what happened. Thank you for bringing this to light, as trying as it must be." After hanging up, Joe turned to Elisa, who was watching him expectantly. "They're taking responsibility," he said, relaying the conversation. Elisa's smile widened. "See? Something good came out of all this." Joe crouched down beside Hunter, scratching behind his ears. "Looks like you're famous now, buddy." Hunter responded with a playful bark, his tail thumping against the floor. Joe chuckled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Later that day, Joe and Elisa took Hunter to a local park. The sprawling green space, filled with the sounds of laughter and the distant bark of other dogs, felt like the perfect place to celebrate their reunion. Joe removed Hunter's leash, watching as the German shepherd bounded across the field, his movements full of energy and freedom. "Look at him," Elisa said, her voice warm. "He's happy." Joe watched Hunter chase a butterfly, his tongue lolling out as he trotted back to them. "Yeah," Joe said, "for the first time in a long time, so am I." As they sat on a bench, enjoying the sunshine, a man approached them cautiously. He wore a faded army cap and had a service dog by his side, a Labrador retriever with a calm demeanor. Leo glanced at. "Excuse me," the man said. "Are you Sergeant Carter?" Joe nodded, rising to shake the man's hand. "That's me. I just wanted to say thank you," the man said, his voice steady but emotional. "I saw your video, what you did. It matters. People like us, we need someone to stand up for us." Joe felt a lump rise in his throat. "I didn't do it alone," he said, glancing down at Hunter. "I had help." The man smiled and reached down to pet Hunter. "He's a good dog." "The fest," Joe replied, his voice filled with pride. As the man walked away, Joe sat back down, his heart full. He looked at Lisa, who squeezed his hand, and then at Hunter, who had plopped down in the grass, his head resting on Joe's foot. For the first time in years, Joe felt like things were going to be okay. The world wasn't perfect, but today it was a little better. For him, for Hunter, and for every veteran who came after them. "Let's go home, buddy," Joe said, his voice steady and sure. Hunter barked once, and together they headed back toward the future they had both fought so hard to reclaim. At least the hunting picture was interesting.